Next up, we have the SPARS Pandemic Project that was facilitated by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. And this is hypothetically to take place 2025 to 2028. This drill, I call it a drill, was run in October of 2017. They begin with a disclaimer. This is a hypothetical scenario designed to illustrate the public health risk communication challenges that could potentially emerge during a naturally occurring infectious disease outbreak requiring development and distribution of novel and/or investigational drugs, vaccines, therapeutics, or other medical countermeasures. So, two things about that disclaimer. One, it specifies that it's a naturally occurring, challenges that could potentially emerge during a naturally occurring infectious disease outbreak. You'd think that natural would be just implicit in this, I guess, as opposed to what an intentionally developed bioweapon. But they want you to know naturally occurring. And secondly, for that disease outbreak requiring development and distribution of novel and/or investigational drugs, that means untested drugs that people will be skeptical about. And that is the kind of undercurrent of this, is that we need to disseminate something to the population, the global population, that is not going to be a real crowd pleaser. How do we do it? Possible future in 2025, the echo chamber, unbridled global access to information coupled with social fragmentation and self-affirming worldviews. The following narrative comprises a futuristic scenario that illustrates communication dilemmas concerning medical countermeasures that could plausibly emerge in the not-so-distant future. All right, so not-so-distant future. Almost like they see it coming. Well, now this was developed in 2017. That's the same year that Fauci had said that this administration is going to face a surprise outbreak. So, not so distant future, surprise outbreak, almost like they knew it was coming. Ultimately, a world comprised of isolated and highly fragmented communities with widespread access to information technology, dubbed the echo chamber, was selected as the future in which the prospective scenario would take place. The prospective scenario is not intended to predict events to come. Rather, it's meant to serve as a plausible narrative. Again, just reassuring that this isn't a prediction. We're not saying it's going to happen. We just need to invest tons and tons and tons of resources into what we're going to do if something like this were to happen hypothetically. So they're concerned that it's a world comprised of isolated and highly fragmented communities with widespread access to information technology. So they're saying that the internet is a problem. They can secure and have secured the mainstream media. They control that narrative completely. All you need to know to evidence that is the fact that they all say the same thing. Nobody's saying, well, what about this? Nobody's giving alternative perspectives any airtime. It's all the same narrative. So they already have that. They already have Netflix. They already have Hollywood. They have the music industry. They have the academic community. So the only problem left where there's freedom of thought and those thoughts are being shared openly is the internet, where they are finding it very difficult to control what people think. And they're investing a lot of effort into doing that as well. Johns Hopkins actually has quite a report on that, and that's, to me, one of the most frightening of these documents, super Orwellian, and that's in another video that I did. which will lay that out, and what I'm talking about, how they're really focused on clamping down on this information control. They are getting the CIA and the FBI and the NSA, Department of Homeland Defense, crazy stuff, getting them involved in this. So it's big. They're gonna super clamp down on the internet, and you're not gonna be allowed. Like this is going away, I imagine. They'll probably arrest me too. Who knows? And that would sound ridiculous, but they've already made it so that I can't share, I can't organize an event, I can't create a group on Facebook. And that just came from nothing. It wasn't in response to a post I made. It was just about the time of the election. They just did that to a bunch of people I know, and I was one of them. Just, okay, you're not going to be able to do this anymore. Indefinitely, too. Not just like for 2 weeks, you're in the dog pound. Indefinitely. I can never do that ever. So there is a list of some kind somewhere, and you are or are not identified as a problematic citizen. This scenario was designed to illustrate the public health risk communication challenges associated with distribution of emergency medical countermeasures during an infectious disease pandemic. In other words, how are we going to convince the public to get vaccinated with Colosevir? That's their version of Moderna or Pfizer. It's an untested vaccine. So they really went all out. They've got, this poor lady is the first to get hit with SPARS in St. Paul. The SP in SPARS is St. Paul. St. Paul Acute Respiratory Syndrome, I believe, is what it stands for. So I think I said in an earlier video that this originated in China, but I was thinking of Crimson Contagion. For this one, they chose the Philippines. And so this lady and her church group went out to the Philippines, and they started getting sick, and she was the first to die. So they create that article. One CDC scientist recalled reading a recent ProMed dispatch describing the emergence of a novel coronavirus in Southeast Asia and ran a pan-coronavirus PCR test. A week later, CDC team confirmed that the 3 patients were in fact infected with a novel coronavirus, which was dubbed the St. Paul Acute Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, after the city where the first cluster of cases had been identified. So that's kind of the backdrop to this whole hypothetical scenario. The CDC monitored the situation closely, working with partners in Southeast Asia to quickly develop a case definition for SPARS. Given that flu season was just getting underway, and that a rapid diagnostic test for SPARS infection was not yet available, CDC officials could not be sure if these were in fact true cases of SPARS. This is sounding familiar yet? As transmission of SPARS was determined to occur via droplet spread, the CDC initially recommended that everyone diligently maintain hand hygiene and frequently disinfect potentially contaminated surfaces. They also have, since this is really social media focused, CDC tweets that came out, which are pretty reminiscent of the real ones that the CDC put out. Travel plans? Hashtag stop SPARS by washing your hands and avoiding public places if you feel sick. If you feel ill, seek medical attention. Use the vampire cough and avoid others to prevent the spread of SPARS. Practice good hygiene during your Thanksgiving travels. Bring home leftovers, not SPARS. So they had a lot of foresight go into the tweets of the CDC as well. At the outset of the SPARS outbreak, physicians' understanding of the disease stemmed primarily from extremely severe cases resulting in pneumonia or hypoxia that required hospitalization and extensive medical treatment. Here we have where they're saying that a lot of the symptoms people are having were perceived by the flu. So as a result, early case fatality estimates were inflated. And that should sound familiar too. That was the case with COVID. Now, since we're on it, the death rate, let's have a quick look at that. In 2014, it was 8.2. In 2015, it was 8.5. 2016, 8.5. 2017, 8.7. 2018, 8.6. 2019 showed a significant decrease to 8.28, and in 2020, 8.31. So had we not seen a really significant drop from 2018 to 2019, 2020 would be a decrease in death rate, not an increase. The only reason it's an increase, and it's only a very slight increase from 2019, is because 2019 was exceptionally low compared to the previous years at 8.28 as opposed to 8.7 in 2017 or 8.6 in 2018. And so if it had stayed consistent with 2018, say it was 8.6 or 8.5, then 8.31 would be a decrease. So 8.28, that's almost 8.3. You can round up. And in 2020, you can round it to 8.32, so it's almost the same. And what it's not taking into account is the fact that flu deaths suspiciously vanished in the exact same proportion as COVID deaths increased. It also doesn't take into account that murder increased and suicide skyrocketed as well. This comes from the CIA World Fact Book. Now, these are my notes, but I cited my source. It's the CIA World Fact Book is where those numbers come from. So early case fatality estimates were inflated. Carrying on. First, the virus had an extended incubation period, 7 to 10 days. Thus, infected persons could spread the virus for up to nearly a week before showing symptoms of the disease themselves. It's almost like they're writing about COVID-19 a year from now rather than writing about a fictional SARS virus in 2017, because that is the exact thing that we saw with COVID-19. That was the narrative for the longest time. I don't know if it still is. That it doesn't matter if you're not showing symptoms, you're still going to be able to spread it for up to, I think they were saying 10 days prior to the onset of symptoms. So same thing here with SARS. Pregnant women and those with chronic respiratory conditions like asthma and emphysema were also at a higher risk. Oops, upside down here. Following each one of these, we have a communication dilemma. This is just a set of discussion questions for the globalists to answer to further secure their grasp on how things are going to be carried out. The communication dilemma has a subheading. This one is engendering public trust and a sense of self-efficacy when a crisis is still evolving and health information is incomplete. Engendering public trust, a strong focus of theirs, as we've seen ever since probably prior to the Kissinger report and the UN's World Plan for Population Control. That was a lot of the same kind of talk. How do we make sure that we don't appear to be the bad guys here? So the strong focus on engendering public trust. The Health Alert Network says there's a possible cure. Based on previous trials in other coronavirus patients, the antiviral Countermeasure is the leading candidate. However, neither the efficacy nor safety profile had been determined for SARS cases. Okay, so same thing with our vaccination. We're in the exact same scenario. We've got this vaccination. Maybe we could use it, but we have not shown efficacy yet. There is widespread concern in public health circles that travel over Christmas and New Year's would spark a global pandemic. The WHO's efforts promoted interventions originally designed for influenza and other respiratory pathogens such as hygiene, social distancing, and isolation of suspected cases, all of which were less effective against SARS. Countermeasure, we go into detail with that later. In their discussion questions to follow this section, what kinds of outreach could public health agencies perform in advance of a crisis to mitigate any perceived lack of transparency? In other words, this is going to look awful suspicious, trying to convince people to take this without really a strong foundation for doing so. How do we make it look like there's no lack of transparency when there definitely is? Here they have a message from Greta Smithson, the Vice President for Animal Health. says, given the millions of vaccinations required for Region 7, this resulted, so they're talking about giving this vaccination to animals, which resulted in measurable losses to the animal population. However, these were acceptable compared to those from respiratory infection itself. Therefore, they're saying that this calosivir ended up killing a bunch of animals. We're going to use it anyway. That doesn't reflect reality, though. I mean, we don't see that with Moderna and Pfizer, but actually we do. When you tell somebody that Moderna and Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, all these vaccines, they don't have longitudinal studies to back their efficacy, the response is, yes, they do. Actually, they were focusing on coronavirus vaccines for a really long time. And COVID-19 is no different. So those are applicable to COVID-19. The problem is, in those coronavirus studies, and I've got a document, I'm going to show you this later so that you don't have to take my word for it, the animals died in those trials. Those are the studies they're referencing. And here we have the same thing. Animals died in the trials. We're going to use it anyway because the alternative is that everybody's going to die from SPARS if we don't, except the case fatality rates were inflated. So they don't really know that anyway. HHS Secretary Nagel agreed in principle to invoke the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, thereby providing liability protection for SynBio. That would be like our biotech that funds Pfizer, I think among others, and future vaccine providers in the event that vaccine recipients experience any adverse side effects. So we see this in real time as well. There's going to be side effects. Here's what we have to do. We're going to remove all liability. We're going to roll out this vaccine prematurely. We're going to really strongly coerce people to take it. They haven't mandated it yet. And we're justified in doing that because the alternative is people are just going to die. So we have to do something. When we start seeing significant vaccine injuries occur from this, too bad, there's no recourse. We have removed ourselves from any liability because of the Emergency Preparedness Act, which we have enacted. Discussion questions that follow this. Maintaining trust in government processes for ensuring the timely development of safe and effective vaccines when novel threats arise. Food for thought. The first one is, how might federal health authorities avoid people possibly seeing an expedited SPARS vaccine development and testing process as somehow rushed and inherently flawed? What do you mean somehow rushed? They're saying right here that it's rushed. Even though that process still meets the same safety and efficacy standards as any other vaccine. How does it meet the same safety and efficacy standards of any other vaccine when other vaccines are backed by longitudinal studies? How can you demonstrate that something is safe long-term? That's what we want to know. We don't want to know, am I going to drop dead right away after I take this? We want to know, am I fine 15 years from now after I take this? Or is this going to start a slow process of cancer or whatever? What's it going to do to me? You can't determine that no matter how well researched you think something is without observing. You can't observe without a longitudinal study. You have to have a cohort of participants, experimental participants, that you observe over the course of time. That's how you know, and there is no other way to do it. If there is no observation, there is no science. Science is based on observation. If you can't observe it, if you can't get data from direct observation, then it's not scientific. So when they say, even though that process still meets the same safety and efficacy standards as any other vaccine, that's a blatant lie. It doesn't. You can't without a longitudinal study. Second question, how might federal health authorities respond to critics who propose that liability protection for SPARS vaccine manufacturers jeopardizes individual freedom and well-being? So they know that people are going to have a response to this when it is impacting their freedom. And finally, long-term effects are not yet known. What are the potential consequences of health officials over-reassuring the public about the potential risks of a novel SPARS vaccine when long-term effects are not yet known? Long-term effects are not yet known. Let's go back up to number 1. Safety and efficacy standards as any other vaccine have been met. Well, which one is it? Next page. We've got a statement here. CDC officials say SPAR's drug may be ineffective. Use it anyway. Guess who else said that? That's right. Our leaders are saying that right now. It may not be terribly effective, but you got to get it regardless. Additionally, while initial hopes had been that Countermeasure would, in addition to treating the disease, prevent or reduce transmission, this was not the case. Does that sound familiar? So the vax is ineffective, has many side effects, and is distributed anyway. Local citizens posted, tweeted, chatted, and zapped real-time impressions of the drug. When they say zapped, they have a hypothetical social media platform called ZapQ. So when you zap something, it's like you tweet something on Twitter. So they zapped real-time impressions of the drug. While some had claimed the drug was effective and even life-saving, most reported no effect and claimed that the drug had caused additional side effects such as headache, nausea, and body aches. So here we go. We're starting to see these reports come in. And you can see these too. Now, your TV's not going to tell you because they've got a narrative to uphold. But if you go to the VAERS reporting website, that's a database for people to report adverse vaccine side effects. There are a lot of them coming in. I listened to a particular show where they're doing nothing but taking callers who are calling in and reporting vaccine injuries and what they've experienced. People are experiencing paralysis. This one actually was featured on the news, but it was featured on the news because it had a positive spin to it. The point was, this is going to hurt you, take it anyway. So this woman took the vaccine. You may have seen this. She gets paralyzed. And during her interview, she said, this paralyzed me. I think it's a great thing. Everybody should go out and take the vaccine, believe it or not. So her contention was that the problem is that there's not enough funding. One thing I know about big pharma and vaccine producers is that they don't have enough money. She's right. They're underfunded. That's the problem. That's why she's paralyzed. And the message still is, you need to take this, which is insanity. That's what Stockholm Syndrome is. Stockholm Syndrome is when usually it's in reference to people who are kidnapped and they develop an affinity for their kidnappers. All right, so they know it's going to be damaging. How do you convince people to do it anyway? The communication after this is appropriately tailoring public health messages to address the concerns and cultures of specific communities. Appropriately tailoring public health messages. Does that sound like propaganda? How could social media have been used to supplement traditional methods of collecting data about Countermeasure's effectiveness and side effects? So, to me, it sounds like what we're seeing now with Facebook, I'm really only on Facebook, so I can only speak to that. When you try to post something about COVID-19 and it conflicts with the narrative that you're intended to believe, you get this pop-up that says, go here for COVID-19 facts. That came from this thinking exercise. How are we going to deal with this? Going viral. The next part. All right. This is very interesting. When video of a 3-year-old boy in North Carolina who was hospitalized with SPARS and began... Oh, sorry, I should read the whole sentence. I've got a habit of doing that. Despite the negative response to negative side effects reported by Countermeasure, the public health agencies continued to make progress until February, when a video of a 3-year-old boy in North Carolina who was hospitalized with SPARS and began projectile vomiting immediately after taking a dose of Countermeasure went viral. In the video clip, the boy's physician administers a pediatric dose of liquid Countermeasure. A few minutes later, the boy begins vomiting profusely, chokes, and then faints while his mother shrieks in the background. Well, we've seen that too. Not the vomiting, we've seen the fainting. The nurse takes it and very shortly thereafter just falls over on the stage. So this is happening just as though, it's a script for what we're experiencing now, down to strange details. Another thing to note, something like this is, Why are the plungers depressed when Benjamin Netanyahu is getting his vaccination and all these renowned political figures, actors and actresses are getting their vaccinations? You zoom in on that, the plungers are depressed. That's very clear too. It's not blurry. It's clear. The plunger is already down. They're not getting the vaccination. Just saying. No further comment on that. FDA and other government agencies quickly attempted to remind the public that correlation does not equate to causation and that vomiting was not a known side effect of Colosevir. Like Hank Aaron and Marvin Hagler. They got the vaccine. They died shortly after that. And that's the narrative. We don't really know that the vaccine did it. Could have been anything, really. We're not going to do an autopsy to find out either. Additionally, in their responses, governmental organizations were not able to effectively access all social media platforms. Hence, we have that other Johns Hopkins report you can have a look at. I didn't include that as a part of this What's Going On series. That one is just, I think I called that this video is disinformation, since the whole point of that whole strategy is to take complete Orwellian authoritarian control over the internet and social media. That will be enlightening to look at, probably. Several members of Congress were very active on sites like Twitter. Okay, we don't need that. Food for thought. Responding to the power of graphic images of a child in distress. One of the questions here: what MCM communication challenges and opportunities are likely to emerge among up-and-coming youth audiences who are avid consumers of interactive and visual forms of information? In other words, it is crucial that we brainwash the youth for what we are about to do. They're going to see this imagery. It's going to be pretty much undeniable. Bad things are happening as a direct result of this vaccination. What are we going to do about that? Talking about messages approved by cross-agency committee. These messages are broadly shared via all relevant government agencies, internet and social media accounts. In an effort to further reach certain population subgroups, agency officials enlisted the help of well-known scientists, celebrities, and government officials to make short videos, zap clips, and in a few cases, give interviews to major media outlets, which we do see. Among those chosen were former President Jacqueline Bennett, BZ, a popular hip-hop star, Paul Farmer, a co-founder of Partners in Health. We don't need to look at Paul Farmer. We should look at President Jacqueline Bennett, because they did get get a bunch of former presidents up there to condone the vaccination. And we did have that ridiculous, cringy piece of rap propaganda by Run DMC, saying, get the vaccine, don't ask questions, I got it, you get it too, it's so cool. If the doctor says it's okay for me, it's okay for you. And literally just saying, I mean, the lyrics are they're so dumb and they're so blatant. So Run DMC, complicit in disseminating propaganda now. So another thing that's very closely reflected in here, it's like, was this a plan or what? BZ, a popular hip-hop star. Now, also bear in mind, they're focusing on the African-American community and tailoring their message to them. That's why they went with Run DMC, or in this case, BZ, because Black people in particular are skeptical of things like vaccination because they know about the Tuskegee experiments. Even if everybody else wants to pretend that didn't happen, they know that the government was involved in intentionally infecting the African-American community with syphilis over the course of many years. So they know that the Black community is going to be skeptical. Many aren't, many are, but how do we, if we could get some cool rappers to say, hey, do this, then maybe we'll get some more people on board. The campaign produced mixed results. Common messaging did reduce public confusion, evinced by a 15 to 23% increase in the public's correct understanding of SPARS and Closevere. The public's correct understanding. This is what you're supposed to think about it. And what is the correct understanding for something that is not well understood? This is supposed to be a novel coronavirus. This is supposed to be a novel experience. So remember, well, I shouldn't say remember, I talked about this with the other Johns Hopkins report. They talk about their concern with information voids. When there's an unknown, there's the potential for people to fill in those gaps. We have to fill those gaps ahead of time so that they can't do it with whatever narrative we want, whether it's accurate or not. So that helps provide the correct understanding. Not long after, 60 Minutes aired live national, not long after BZ's rap propaganda, 60 Minutes aired a live nationally broadcast interview with former President Bennett. When asked if she would want her new grandson to receive Closevere, Bennett, caught off guard, paused, and eventually gave a hesitant, somewhat contradictory response. Why would Bennett be reluctant? It seems the SPARS exercise is an effort to get people to take a dangerous vaccine, not a safe one. So they talk about a satirical news feed that's problematic. I have to assume that's a direct reference to the Babylon Bee, which they have been trying to kick off. They've been trying to deplatform that, and they would if they could. They can't just yet. I think they need legislation for it. But right now, a lot of these people, a lot of these platforms, they've gotten so big that they can hire a big team of lawyers, and that's what a lot of them end up doing and have to do on a regular basis in order for them just to, which is ridiculous for a satirical web platform on social media. That's ridiculous. It's satire, but it's powerful. They can still get their point across, and they really don't like Babylon Bee. Multiple message board threads questioned in detail the accelerated clinical trial process. Others examined alternative treatments for SPARS. Throughout this, they really vilify questioning the mainstream narrative and also offering alternative medications. In this communication dilemma, following this section is overlooking communication platforms used by specific groups. So really talking about honing in on the communication platforms, making sure that they're not saying too many things that they're not supposed to be saying. Here's some more discussion questions they have. Why is active monitoring of the information sea in which the public is swimming critical to these efforts of authorities to create conditions and provide information that support recommended public health behaviors? Number 2, how might a strong social media presence allow the federal government and public health officials more broadly to anticipate potential communication issues? So they're going to want that federal government involved with social media. I just thought was interesting. On July 9th, 2026, a week before Coravax was released for distribution in the United States, that's another vaccine, the power grid at the Grand Coulee Dam in eastern Washington state experienced a catastrophic failure. So in this scenario, they had a big power failure. I find that interesting because that's exactly what happened in Texas in the winter. People froze to death because of it. Now, there's another bunny trail that's worth looking into. I won't get into that, but the consideration here was basically the idea is that we need people to kind of glom onto this narrative, and in order to do that, they have to receive the message continually. Now, remember that the CIA has put an awful lot of investment into figuring out how to essentially put people into a hypnotic state, make people more suggestible, and repeated information is how you do that. Hermann Göring said the same thing. This is just propaganda 101. So what's presented here in this document is, what if people lose power and therefore they're not receiving the messages on a regular basis? What do we do so they're still receiving the message that we want them to receive? Remember, this was written in 2017. I feel like it gets blurry when I get too close. You see that? Black Lives Matter they bring into it. Repurposing hashtags like